All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGrosse. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I have the great honor to be able to talk to someone whose work I've been following for quite a while. I actually saw him perform one time and was blown away. And ever since then, I have wanted to talk to him, but always have been a little intimidated. And so this is a really great opportunity. We got connected from a PR firm, and which is good because that kind of like really eased the transition and made it easy for me to get kicked off on this. And so with that, I'm going to shut up and we are going to talk to Tim Exile. Hey, Tim, how's it going?
Very well, Darwin. Well, actually, I think it's the things are mutual. I was also a bit intimidated. I've been following your podcast for a long time now. I'm a regular listener, so I was always a bit like, no, I couldn't bring it upon myself to reach out to you directly and say, hey, we really nice to speak to you. So, but anyway, here we are. So it's great we get to speak. Thank you.
Yeah, here we are, in fact. Well, this is really phenomenal, and I know that one of the reasons we're going to talk, though, is specifically about an effort that you've got going right now, which is a software system called the Endless package. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, I think that's why we're talking, but it's also clearly, I've done a little research on it, and it's clearly sort of like, it's more than a software package. It looks a little bit like maybe your passion gig too. So I'd like to hear a little bit about what you've got going there.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it's almost the world. I mean, I think the core Endless community might describe it as something like that. And it definitely feels like that when you go on our Discord server and you see what the community are doing on Endless. Endless is a live collaborative music creation platform. We have an iOS app that we launched in the App Store just over a year ago, and we have a macOS app which launched just before Christmas last year, and the Windows version is coming very soon. It's definitely an extension of my life's work. I have always been passionate about the idea of music as something we do rather than a product we consume. And that's definitely in the DNA of Endless. I mean, it is to take the macro view, we're definitely trying something quite ambitious, which is really to return the idea of music as an activity we do together to consciousness, I suppose. And that, that idea has gained a lot of currency recently with the beginning of, doorless jamming, modular performances. When I started improvising probably the best part of 2 decades ago, improvising electronic music was beyond niche, and very few people even knew that it was actually possible, because at the time, electronic music was all about designing sounds, laying them out in a pattern with blocks on the screen in a DAW or a sequencer, and then hitting spacebar and seeing what it actually sounds like. The idea of it being performative was not really around 20 years ago. And now it is, which I think is wonderful. And we're moving into a world where creativity is becoming something that we do in real time together. I mean, there's a lot of big platforms recently, like multiplayer games like Fortnite, live streaming platforms like Twitch. Most recently, we've had this real-time social audio platform, Clubhouse, and it feels like this is where creativity is going. So in the 20th century, we used to value creativity as a means to an end to produce content, which would be printed up on millions of discs, distributed worldwide, and sold at a huge profit. So it was all about creating content and building attention. Whereas I think where we're going now is people are becoming known not necessarily for what they have done, but what they can do. When you follow someone's YouTube channel, you enjoy the content they produce, but you get to know them as a person. You get to look forward to the next thing that's going to come out. And that's becoming more and more real time. And so this is the world that Endless is going into. Apologies, I went right up to the macro layers. So I'll put the mic. I'll leave the mic there.
No, that's really cool though, because it does kind of like lay down the gauntlet of what you're talking about, and it's actually interesting to think about our perceptions of the value of performance changing. Performance is no longer something that's encapsulated in a product and then shipped out for profit. Instead, the performance is the thing that's treasured. It's the thing that people want to experience, and it's that experience and that sharing that actually is kind of gaining a lot of value. Now, it's interesting to me that you came out with a highly collaborative product right at a time when people were stuck in their basements, like trying to figure out how to even connect with their friends. I imagine that there actually was, to a certain extent, it like helped with a problem that needed a solution, right?
Yeah, it was definitely weirdly timely that we launched the mobile app on the 31st of March 2020.
Oh goodness.
And the world had literally just gone into, the entire world was in lockdown.
Yeah.
And yeah, we got a ton of press. We got a huge influx of users onto the platform. And it was I mean, you can't say it was a good thing because obviously it was a terrible thing. We were in the middle of a pandemic. But there was something a little bit magical, I say, about the timing. And then we were right in the middle. There was just so much experimentation. People were, to some extent, it felt like people were actually fascinated by this new normal, and the tone with which you communicate with people would change every day as people got their head around things. And everybody, I remember trying to get live streaming cameras, and one week I managed to get a Logitech Brio, no problem at all. The next week I wanted to get another one, and you couldn't find one anywhere. So everybody was experimenting with live streaming, and it just felt there was this real sense of wanting to come together, specifically because we couldn't come together. So yeah, it was weirdly magical, obviously horrific,
right. Yeah. I don't think we have to talk about how terrible it was, but I do think it's interesting that humanity, and especially those of us who are artists, had to find a way, because it's the one thing that I think is really clearly a tenet of artistry, is that you don't do it just because it's convenient. In fact, a lot of times it's incredibly inconvenient to be an artist. I think it would be a lot better to be like a hedge fund manager at almost any turn, right? But the fact of the matter is you do it because you need to do it. And you were there at a transition when people needed to still express themselves artistically, and found a lot of the avenues kind of sealed up. I'm going to want to come back to this because I have a ton of questions related to this already. But before we do that, one of the things that I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about how they got to be the artists and the makers and this kind of stuff. And you are fascinating to me because, like I said, I got a chance to experience your art in action. It blew me away. I have always appreciated the things that you've put on video. Some of the things you did were so inspiring to me, and I think to a lot of people. But you've also have this history of working with native instruments, on doing different kinds of instrument development, putting together this live show stuff. But now you're in full on software development mode too. And I'm wondering where a person comes from that is able to develop the musical taste and the musical vision that you have, but also the technological savvy and capability that you're bringing as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got a fairly well-rehearsed story that I trot out, and I know that the Endless community I've sort of bored them to tears with.
Yeah,
with
right. So something maybe a little different than the pat answer, right? Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, the key points still hold. So I'll hang a bit of a deeper dive off the key points. But when I was 4 years old, I picked up the violin. I started learning the violin. Apparently, my mum tells me it's the first thing that I actually said yes to. I was a pretty kind of uncooperative kid. And then, I wanted, what I loved about the violin was it was so embodied. I put my bow on the string, I move my body, music happens. I stop moving my body, the music stops. So, I think that first musical experience has really set the frame for everything else that I've done. That's how I understand music primarily, is something that happens when it's being done rather than is consumed once it's been recorded and distributed. And I was definitely, again, my mum tells me that I used to just sit. We had this house in the Cotswolds right in the middle of the countryside. We had this little B road running past the front door, and apparently I'd just watch cars go past and get fascinated by the sound, the Doppler shift as they go past, and as they sort of go up through the valleys, you could hear. And it's one of my strongest memories is like the phase shifting that happens when cars move through the valley that I grew up in. So I think there was always some kind of fascination with timbre and sound. And I suppose, well, before, this is going really deep, but I had a couple of near-death experiences when I was very, very young, like pre-verbal. And it actually took me, I'd say, a few years of therapy in my late 20s before I actually figured out how significant this was. And then I did a bit of research on the effect that has on young children and how it affects their development. And one of the key markers of pre-verbal kids who've had near-death experiences is being fascinated with music, being fascinated with maths.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and it described, when I started reading the books that researched this, I was just like, oh my God, that's me down to a T. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. And so I think that mixed with that first musical experience basically frames everything that either I've done or has happened to me or that I've sort of stumbled into, or at least been led into through my curiosity. Yeah. Picked up the violin when I was 4 years old. I think I got fed up with it quite quickly. So it's just very, very hard. I wanted to be able to express myself very quickly. I wanted to learn, but it takes years to make a half decent sound on the violin, and you have to practice once a week to keep it up.
Yeah.
Once a day to keep it up. A week off, and you really lose that dexterity.
Yeah.
When I was a teenager, a friend lent me this bootleg rave tape, and I think I listened to it 2 or 3 hours a night, every night for like a couple of months. And it was utterly mind blowing. I had no idea what was going on. I was 12 years old. And of course, my frame of reference was embodied music making. So I thought the music was being played by people somehow with these crazy machines. And then, once I started to research how rave music was made and played and what raves were, I was just like, oh, okay, this is actually music that's made in studios and pressed onto vinyl and then mixed by DJs, which I think I was probably a little bit disappointed by. Right. But anyway, I taught myself to DJ, got some decks. I didn't find them fun enough, so I went to Tandy, which is a kind of electronics shop, bought a bunch of components like extra potentiometers and switches, so I can make them go backwards and go from 0 to 100% and stuff like that. And then, of course, they broke.
Of course.
And then I started messing around in the recording studio at school, and we had a reel-to-reel tape machine and a really big mixing desk and a flex unit, some old synth, and I just kind of hack and dub mix music. And I was trying to make sort of house and breakbeat, techno, hardcore, jungle stuff by playing drum beats and recording them on an 8-track. I mean, it was lunacy, really.
Right.
And then I saved up for a sampler and started to actually get into the quote unquote proper way to produce the dance music of the time with a sampler and an Atari sequencer. And that sort of laid the foundations for me actually participating in the music industry that was going on at the time. making records, releasing them, hounding record label owners to release my music, etc. And being a sort of general sort of low level pain in the ass.
Right. That's how you get started, right?
Well, exactly. That is, yeah. But I think it was always, I never felt when I was making records that I was really in the right skin. I think, the curiosity. I remember it was like around the late 90s, and I got my first PC, and I would spend, I'd dial. No, actually, it was my mum's computer. I'd dial up through the modem we had in the house, in my parents' house, and I'd search for these weird esoteric VST plugins and ways to process sounds, and they never lived up to what I wanted them to be.
Right.
So I just started messing around with coding. Well, not coding. It was all node-based stuff like Sync
Reaktor.
Modular.
You really got into Sync Modular, which became Generator, which became Reaktor, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I dived into pure data a bit, but at the time, I think because it was fairly early and it was fairly open source, there were quite a few modules that didn't work properly. So I built an entire system in pure data, but I couldn't actually get it to work properly.
Okay.
So yeah, I did. I mean, the rabbit hole that I really fell down was Reaktor, and to some extent, I mean, I'm still at least partially in that rabbit hole. There's even this year, a couple of weekends, I've been doing some creative coding projects in Reaktor. Yeah, that's a sort of relatively deep dive into the background.
So it's interesting to me that the skin of the typical record producer didn't feel right, and that Reaktor, Sync Modular to Reaktor, that framing did. What was it about coding specifically that scratched an itch for you that you couldn't have gotten from getting, say, a modular synth, or like diving down the hole of something like at the time the Nord modular was floating around, so you probably could have bought something like that, and something that was more a traditional musical instrument. I mean, Reaktor, it's music focused, but it's by no means a traditional musical instrument in any way, shape, or form, right?
Yeah. I don't think there's anything specifically about coding that got me into coding or programming. I still feel a little bit like a charlatan calling it coding, because it was essentially wiring up boxes and wires, but it is programming. Yeah, it wasn't that I wanted to program things. It's just I had a very clear idea of the things that I wanted to do, and none of the stuff out there did what I wanted to do. And I think specifically, I was really interested in the potential of taking off-the-shelf MIDI controllers, particularly, the Behringer ones from the BCR 2000, the BCF 2000.
Right.
Just, I mean, obviously it's a shame what's happened recently, but let's let that slide. But those products were incredibly forward thinking, and quite honestly, I still think that the opportunity that they offered then has never really been taken up, I would say, because they were so programmable that they were basically designed exactly for someone like me. And I wanted to make a very physical, very haptic instrument that had a really deep, really tight integration with software, where you don't feel like you never interact with the screen. So the flow machine that I built in Reaktor for these interfaces, there is no interaction. When I'm playing live, there is zero interaction with the mouse and the screen whatsoever. There's a few things that need to be represented on the screen, but most of it is just motorized faders, bank switching, and performing. And that was what I wanted to do, because that was essentially bringing that framing of the violin when I was a kid into the world of electronics. It had to be physical, haptic interface first, and that was the only way to do it, really. I tried. Yeah, Reaktor was a work that by the time I chose Reaktor, there were a few wormholes I could have fallen down. I could have fallen down the Max wormhole. I could have fallen down further down the Purity wormhole. But I think at the time, and still now, actually, I'll just come out with my allegiance to Reaktor and Native Instruments in terms of creating really quality DSP with quality interaction with very capable data handling and ability to sort of build frameworks within it. I mean, Reaktor is super powerful, and I think at some stage all the Endless developer team has told me that I should really just start building stuff in C++, given what I try to get Reaktor to do.
Well, yeah, but the other side of it is these node-based systems, and Reaktor, I would say, is primary among them. It's a kind of high level, so you can deal with a filter without having to think about coefficients and multiplications and feedback and all this other horse shit. You can think of a filter as a filter and really engage with it as a part of an instrument build without though having to be like, oh, here's a pre-made thing that I don't have any effect on. I think Reaktor does a really good job of being right in the middle of those spaces, and it makes a lot of sense that someone with your kind of focus would really gravitate towards that. Now, I'm curious, do you remember what's the first thing that you programmed as a Reaktor patch?
Yeah, it was, I'm not quite sure because the first thing I programmed with a node-based digital modular was in Sync Modular, and I'm pretty sure it was a delay effect. Because at the time, you couldn't load samples into Sync Modular. I was very clear that I wanted to mess around with samples.
Right.
That's always been my thing. That I've always gravitated to that. I'm not quite sure why, but so the first thing I built in Sync Modular, I think used a few different delay modules, and then I fixed the times. So I think I was trying to make a kind of beat repeat beat masher kind of effect. And actually, I think that there's a track one of my first ever 12 inches on no, it was an EP. Was it an EP? Was it? I can't remember. On Moving Shadow. They did this limited series called the MSX series, and there's a track called Bad Diet, which is this kind of crazy Amen mashup. I mean, the actual production of it is terrible. I mean, they literally smashed every transient in that Amen break out of there. So it's just like, instead of like a really crisp, it's like, anyway. But I did use that little instrument to produce with these kind of little twist ups at the end, and those came from that was the first ever thing that I programmed in a digital modular.
That's really interesting. Now, but that does actually kind of point to something else that's important here, because when you talk about kind of the time frame of your musical development, you came to and discarded DJing. You went into production with samplers and all that kind of stuff in kind of a traditional way using computers. I know from watching some of your videos and reading some of your story, you kind of went the whole route of like, I'm going to learn a sequencer, I'm going to learn Pro Tools, I'm going to learn these things, right? You kind of followed that traditional path, but then you got into this node-based programming. But there's another part of it, which is you also got fascinated with looping. And you talk about being fascinated with samples, but I would say that it's not samples in what is thought of in the traditional way. You're actually into it's not looping in the sort of like, I'm going to play acoustic guitar, now I'm going to play harmonica, now I'm going to play a snare drum kind of thing. You treat it like it's a way of capturing live sound and manipulating live sound. It's really it is this kind of like mishmash between looping and sampling, where you're doing sample type manipulation, but it's always with live content, or that's the way it feels to me. It seems like your music has been based off of live audio capture. I mean, is that fair enough to say?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's one of these mysteries that I think I keep on discovering more about why I got into live sampling. And I think it all comes back to this idea of being spontaneous and somehow dialoguing, somehow music creation as being a dialogue at least between you and the equipment that you're using. And then obviously in the case of Endless, which now takes that workflow and makes it collaborative, it's you're actually in dialogue with other people who have the same tech stack at the center of their kind of instrumental experience, I guess. It's this sort of shared instrumental experience. What I really like about live sampling, and particularly then manipulating those live samples, is that it's really conversational the way you create. So, I'll lay something down, and then the way that turns out is never quite, it's not what you intended it to be, but it's also something that will surprise you. You have an idea about a thing you want to do, you do the thing, and then it comes back at you, and it's just like, okay, yeah, no, that is kind of what I intended, but it's also different from what I intended, and it sparks something else. And for me, well, that really is the magic of creativity, and it's also the magic of collaboration. You and I are in a conversation right now, and every time either of us speaks, it sparked off something else in the other person, and so it goes back and forth. And I think for me, it's that interaction, this sort of almost the improvisational yes and. That when a statement is made or some kind of creative act is performed, there's always a space after that to then perform another creative act or reply or do something to the artifact that was created in the first instance. The more I dig into understanding that, and the more I dig into, I guess, building technology that allows musicians to do that together remotely from around the world, the more I realize that this is actually about relationship building and possibly even community building. It's this conversation that this is why I'm really interested in this new world we're moving into, where we're focusing on skills rather than just content, because content is an end point. It's just made this piece of music, go away and listen to this piece of music, and there's nothing really to respond to. I mean, people do respond to it. They'll write reviews, or they'll play it to friends or whatever, but the intention isn't really to spark a conversation.
Well, I think you're onto something there, because, and I would say this, one of the things that, when we moved from, and I would say even in terms of electronic music and dance music, right? When we moved from, whether it was like a bunch of DIN synced Roland boxes that we would kind of like tweak stuff, or people, on the other side of things, people who had modular systems that would just like turn knobs and make squealy sounds. We started moving towards the computer, and what we started to do was two things. We, first of all, stripped out anything that wasn't, part of our plan. And secondly, build a lot of guardrails so that it was hard to make mistakes. But one of the things you're talking about here is, first of all, you sort of like celebrate the idea of making mistakes, because sometimes that can spur you into something new. And secondly, this idea that when you're in a conversation, things are going to happen that are, outside of a plan. And that actually is sort of like a mechanism by which creativity, a platform that you can launch creativity off of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, the whole idea of the mistake is a weird way of describing it, because I think actually what often happens is there's another bit in between. The idea of the mistake is that it's either exactly right or it's not, and it's wrong.
Completely wrong,
right? You need to identify, and it's completely wrong. You need to find out what's wrong. But I think quite often what I find happens is very much this yes and, which I've got a friend who's an improv comedian who told me about this idea that this is the key tenet behind comedy improv, is it's always yes and. If you're improvising with someone, you never shut anything down. You always say yes, that thing, and something else. Because I think there's always, when we get to the end of a certain creative act or a sentence, there is this period where we sort of regard what's being done and absorb what we've done. And things are revealed in that space, I think. And what's revealed in that space is all the stuff that you didn't really think about when you were very intent on speaking those words or writing those notes or dialing in those effects or whatever. And when you step back, it's just like, oh yeah, more was happening there. In some cases that was unintended, but in other cases it was more like it was just out of scope of what I was thinking of at the time. And that's that space in which magic happens, I think.
Right. Now, I would say that when I looked at you working with your flow system, that's what it was called, right? The flow.
I call it flow. Well, actually, Imogen Heap named it the Flow Machine.
Okay, the Flow Machine.
Because when I went on tour with her, she was just like, Tim, have you got a name for your system? I was like, I don't know. It's like a kind of
bunch of
boxes, kind of flow thingy. It's just like, it's a flow machine. We'll call it the Flow Machine. So that became known as the Flow Machine.
Got it. When I watched you work with that, I saw a number of videos over the years of you working with that. I mean, it was actually really interesting how you would oftentimes, in the creation of your video, you'd be like, oh, I forgot to turn the source on correctly or whatever. And it just, it was interesting because we saw you sort of like, do what would typically be called mistakes. And it's just like, no, that just kind of worked into the flow of the whole thing. And it was part of the process of performing. And I think that that's really amazing. But now, you have kind of developed that, which was very much a solo tool, right? It was the Flow Machine was the Tim Exile machine, really. And I think other people could use that as like a launching point for imagining stuff. But it would have been pretty hard to lay that in front of somebody else and say, hey, go, Now what you've done is you've tried to encapsulate a lot of those ideas into this endless software, but I'm curious, first of all, about when you first started doing that. What gave you the indication that this collaborative effort, this conversation that you talk about, was even a desirable thing? I mean, quite frankly, when you started working on these systems and this collaborative thing, I don't think that there were many people that thought of electronic music, whether it was experimental electronic music or dance music or host production. Nobody thought of that as a collaborative thing. Most people thought of it as something you do in your basement, while you're, waiting to press your first disc, right? How did you imagine this to be a collaborative process? And was it a surprise to you that anybody else was interested in, or did you have an innate feeling like that of course that's what people want to do?
Yeah, I mean, there was a moment. I think we started. So Ash, who's our lead developer, lead engineer, who has built a huge amount of the Endless platform, we started working together on just some prototypes, messing around in Reaktor actually in 2015. The initial prototypes were just Reaktor patches. They were basically the Flow Machine. So Ash had a version of the Flow Machine, and we were trying adding extra features. And I think one of the most powerful features of Endless is that you've got this riff history of every single thing that's ever happened in a jam, and you can track back through that history right to the very beginning of that jam, which is it's a really, really powerful feature. It's very freeing because you can keep on moving forwards. You can always try stuff out, and you're not going to destroy anything. It's always going to be there for you to recall. So Ash and I were working together on this, and he had his version of the Flow Machine. I had my version of the Flow Machine next to each other. He had his riff history of what he'd been working on, and he was kind of showing me some of the things he'd been doing, and I had my one as well. They were all on Ableton Push 1. So we built this using the colored pads.
Sure.
We built the system browsing back through riffs, and he was playing back through his, and I was playing back through mine. And I was just like, it would be really cool if we could actually have a shared one of these histories. And that's how the idea of making it collaborative came about. And since then, it just became quite obvious that was a very cool thing.
Yeah. Okay.
I remember the first time we had it working, I think it was maybe 2018, in late 2018, we got a version of the iOS app working with this shared history, and we staged a jam with 5 people and one person, a couple in the UK, someone in the US, and someone in Germany. It was spine tingling. It was absolutely spine tingling, and I think that we knew then that experience that basically we needed to focus on getting people to that experience as quickly as possible, because it is an utterly magical experience when you're jamming together live with people from all over the world. You add a layer to what's going on, and 10 seconds later that layer comes back with some different effects or another layer added on top of it. It really is conversational. I think that's something that humans just innately desire, because the most powerful thing about being in conversation is that you really get to be seen and understood, and you get to see and understand people, and you get to do that sort of in turns in an almost game-like way.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I watched some video of this in action, and I'm having trouble imagining how some of this stuff works, because you talk about the shared riff history, and I saw things happening in video work that I didn't understand because it was different than any other collaborative system I've seen. Oftentimes, what a collaborative system looks like is a shared clock system, where people then are doing something locally and the clocking is shared. But what I saw in the videos really did look like the content somehow magically in the background was moving from device to device and was available on no matter what device you picked up or who was working with any device. Am I catching that correctly?
Yes. To do a quick deep dive, it's one of these things that it's almost dangerous in a way to getting into describing exactly how it works with the power of voice, because it benefits from diagrams. So basically, it's asynchronous. So it's actually built on a fork of the technology used to build Dropbox. So essentially, you've got.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to say what it looked like to me is like there was a musical Dropbox in action. So I'm glad to hear that I wasn't like totally out in left field.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. So it's basically Dropbox with a bunch of modifications. So everybody has their own transport, and essentially as soon as you create something and commit it, that's sent to everybody else in the jam. They will pick it up and it will slot into their local transport wherever they are in the program. So it's a modulo.
Got it. That's really fascinating, but it's also interesting to see sort of like business logic brought into kind of like subverted into artistic purposes. I have to say that I really appreciate that a lot. Now, in your mind or in your experience, what's sort of like the coolest thing that you've seen someone do with this system?
Oh, gosh. There's so much cool stuff that people do with it. I know that, Imogen Heap's done some really cool stuff with it. She has performed live. I think there was a big expo somewhere in the Middle East, and I can't remember where it was now, but they had a bunch of musicians on stage, and Imogen was piped in via Endless to a live show in a physical concert hall from her house just outside London. That's really cool. I think that some of the live performances and live streams that we've done with Endless, with the community, staging it directly on our Twitch platform, on our Twitch channel, those have been really exciting, because we bring the camera feeds of people, and we also, we make it look pretty, and we stream the audio from a local machine, and it feels like an event. I'd say generally the really exciting stuff has been staging, I'd say, these kind of collaborative music creation rituals.
Right.
We did a bunch of experiment with NFTs, turning endless riffs into NFTs. That was quite exciting, just to be part of that whole world, trying to understand this crazy new technology and this crazy new marketplace and how people were using it. There's so much stuff that people are doing. Oh, really another interesting thing that's happened recently, there's this really great app called Mubert, Mubert, and they create these kind of generative pieces of music where they take a bunch of stems, and then it's basically kind of like auto switching between them, but they create these sort of stations that you can listen to. and quite a few people have taken Endless jams and turned them into these Uber things. So turning a jam into a generative piece of music, I think that's also really interesting. And I think that's something in terms of where we're headed in terms of what we're building for Endless. The next big step for us is how to turn the music that people are creating on Endless either as live performances into something that people would want to come and see or experience in real time, but also that the music that people have created in these jams, turning those into maybe more lean back experiences that people can go to someone's profile and then play through all the stuff they've created, etc.
So now that hopefully, fingers crossed, we're starting to come out of this pandemic world, how do you imagine that changing the way that people are going to interact with this? I mean, so far everything's been kind of like managed and mitigated through things like Twitch or other online services. Do you expect this to be something where either you yourself or your team or just people out in the world start putting together in-person jams? Is this something that you imagine as sort of an outgrowth of what's being developed?
Yeah, one thing I am quite excited about is the idea of being able to. So, yeah, we've got a great sort of office event space in East London, and we signed the lease on that at the beginning of March last year. I think we managed to run one event. So I think the potential of sort of mixed reality, if you like, of events where we could have a few people in a real venue in one place and a few people in a real venue in a few other places around the world, and stage live concerts, live jams linked up between multiple physical spaces. That's something I'm really excited about. In the long run, I don't think the great opening up is a big threat to Endless, because ultimately your own studio setup is not very portable, and it is just it's quite a pain to organize a jam, even with someone just down the road, to find a space.
So true.
So true. Yeah. And there's so much stuff you have to do. You have to find the space, you have to book the space, you have to take all your kit there, you have to disassemble it from your setup, put it in a car or a cab, move it somewhere else, set it up again, and it doesn't sound the way it used to sound. So I think the ability to just plug in through a social network and find people who are online. I mean, this is, in the next 6 months, we're really focusing on all the social features behind Endless. So sure. You can connect with people on the platform, which you can't do yet. You can discover people, so you can get notifications when your friends are online, etc. All this kind of stuff. So I think the convenience and the kind of lack of friction that Endless offers, that we have people collaborating from the US and Canada and Sweden and France and the UK regularly, and to make that work by getting people into a physical space is pretty much impossible.
Sure. Yeah, I imagine. So, unfortunately, our time is up. But before we go, why don't you tell us really quickly what's next on the burner for Endless, but also what's next for you as an artist?
Well, what's next for Endless is, so we're currently fundraising. I'm not actually sure when this podcast is going out. So either we'll be just about to launch a crowd equity campaign, or we'll be in the middle of it, or a bit at the end of it. So that's happening. That's very exciting, because it's going to give our community an opportunity to actually have a stake in the business we're building as well, which I think is exactly how it should be. And then we're raising this money to build out our social features, which is also very, very exciting. The app has been out there quite a bit now, and we know how people behave. We know that if people actually form friendships around Endless, they stick around for a long time and get a huge amount of value, personal and creative value out of it. So we're really excited about that. In terms of me as an artist, I mean, I don't really get that much time to work on music these days. That said, early this year, I did start building something I've been working on for a long time, which is, it's actually an idea around composition, having built an entire career on improvisation. It's basically using the idea of keyframing in videos, in video editors, where you can take a snapshot of all the settings, and then take another snapshot of the settings and morph between multiple snapshots. I've been working on some systems in Reaktor that allow me to do that and also generate visuals at the same time. It's pretty embryonic at the moment, and I very rarely get any time to work on it. But maybe after we got this funding round tied up, I might take a couple of days to work a bit more on that.
That sounds really exciting and really interesting. Well, Tim, I want to thank you for having this chat and for taking time out of your schedule. It sounds like it's packed full. I appreciate you taking the time to have a talk with us.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, and thank you for having me on. It's an honor. I mean, you've spoken to everybody who I'd ever want to speak to, really, pretty much about music and tech. So yeah, thank you. I think it's a great service that you're doing to this community with this podcast. So thank you.
Many thanks to Tim for having the great discussion. Man, I've wanted to talk to him for a long time, and so I'm really glad that we were able to do it. Many thanks to y'all, the listeners, and I want to especially reach out to Mike Lohr. Thanks a lot for meeting up. He and I met while I was in Denver this last week. I will try and let people know when I'm in cities, and if you happen to hear that I'm in your neck of the woods and you want to get together, I'm always up for a hang. I love talking to folks. So in any case, hey, Mike, thanks a lot for going out to lunch with me. I want to thank the rest of you for continuing to listen. I want to thank all the Patreon supporters for supporting the podcast, for our production of the transcriptions, and for keeping the lights on over here while we do this. Thank you so much, all, and I will catch you next time around. Bye.